to the alliance's formation as a response towards the China rise, I want to ask both of you one reader question that China and Russia has signed a massive gas pipeline deal that would make China to be the Russian major ally. So do you believe that a Sino-Russian alliance would be resurrected? And how stable could this alliance be? And its implication to the regional balance of power?
Well, I'm a little bit reluctant to use the word alliance because whereas within this globalized world there is certainly increasing cooperation, but the formation, but the nature of the cooperation is very different from the Cold War era, whereas once you form an alliance, you agree on everything and you cooperate on everything. These are just issues-based cooperations, and whereas countries can enhance their cooperation on one area, they can disagree or compete on other area. So the nature of international relations in today is very different from that of the Cold War era, that we should escape from the notion of ideologically based alliances like during the Cold War. That said, I think those are important geostrategic world development because that increases mutual dependencies between China and Russia on the one hand, and that gives the perception that these two countries are aligning or are enhancing their ties against the formation of another alliance, and that gives a Cold War impression in international relations. But that might give the misperception, missed message to other countries that might force them to choose between sides, that force them to sort of like have an opinion which they do not necessarily have to. So I think we should be more careful and do not over-interpret such development.
Mm-hmm. I would certainly agree with that. Mm-hmm. I would argue that the Putin-Xi Jinping agreement on gas supplies and the new pipeline was a business deal. And if I were analyzing the business deal, I would say the Chinese did very well. And they did very well because of the need from Russia to have alternative places for their one major commodity that country has that it's using to supply and maintain its economy. I think the deal was very good for China, and I don't think it was a strategic deal at all. I think it was, if anything, in the gas strategy, it was a win for China because they have a larger need for energy and a lesser need for Russian energy, and so the relationship was skewed to the Chinese. Now, Mr. Putin, of course, needed a political statement that he had an alternative to the Europeans as he was facing sanctions for his invasion and annexation of Crimea. So there was a trade-off that was very unbalanced. And again, I agree with you, don't miscalculate. Try to understand what's really happening. And that is, the Cold War is long over. Some have suggested that Mr. Putin has re-engaged in the Cold War. He may have Stalinist tendencies or want to rise Russia. That is not a Cold War issue. That's not an ideologically based conflict that we have. We have actually a different change, and that is that 25 years after the Cold War ended, we now have a challenge that there is no future in the post-Cold War period. That is, the post-Cold War period was built on, in Europe in particular, on rules from the Helsinki process, OSCE process. And one of the key rules was you don't change borders by force. And that's the challenge that Mr. Putin has put on the table. Now, that is a very bad signal for East Asia, or Southeast Asia and East Asia, because if that becomes the international rule, that you can change borders by force, then you have a whole different world. It's not a Cold War. It's not an alliance between the Russians and the Chinese. It is an underpinning of our structure right now that is eroding or being challenged. And if it isn't challenged and successfully challenged, then you have the question that you've raised. It's a question about, okay, is that the new rule? Mm-hmm. And I think our challenge is not ideologically. It's not a question of whether in Vietnam you have a system of government, we have a system of government. We have some basic confirmations that we need to have, and that is that borders don't change by violence. And in the South China Seas, or in the East Sea, as you call it, that should be the number one rule. There is no place for violent change. There, you can negotiate, you can have stronger positions or weaker positions, and all the pain that goes with that, but you have, at least from my point of view, and I think also my government's point of view, that violence is not the way to go, and Mr. Putin has challenged that very principle. That's the danger that we have with the Chinese and the Russians and the gas deal. It's not, the business deal was I mean, the Chinese did really well, so, at least in my view.
Yeah, but the dangerous thing, as you said, that we cannot accept the violence to change the borders.
Right.
And of course, the world has generated a lot of international laws, such as the UN clause, and even in the ASEAN, we have a DOC to side with China to respect the status quo. So, but this presents the more challenge that we observed, how we can enforce and engage a power to abide by, you see, mutual shared commitments. They commit to obey that, but they ignore that in some cases. So how we can enforce them?
Well, it's a tough question. I think for China, it's difficult to enforce them to do something unless they themselves realize that it is in their best interest to behave in that way. For example, how to convince China that the law of the sea, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, it's in their very own interest to obey. It's because the China's economic boom, China's economic miracle has been based on booming global trade, and booming global trade would not have happened if the sea was in chaos, if the law of the sea was not respected by countries, and if there was no freedom of navigation, for example. So China has to realize that it is in their national interest, long-term national interest, to preserve freedom of navigation, preserve order at sea, and to keep the current rule-based order in the sea, for it's going to benefit them in the long run. So if China realized that, China would be a force to protect the law of the sea rather than undertaking activities that is going to undermine this whole regime. I think that is the way that we should approach China. I believe that China doesn't think with one mind. There are people in China who really understand the law of the sea, who really understand and sees China's national interest in its full integration with the international community. However, there's other groups of interest, for example, the hawkish, the hardliners, who might be pursuing their own selfish group's interest rather than national interest. They are gaining their short-term gain, making short-term gains or the gains of their groups at the cost or at the expense of their national image, or at their national interest. We have to point China towards that, and as soon as China realizes that, I believe that China is going to behave differently.
I think that's a very good example of what Son just said. It is a challenge for diplomacy, after all. We're in the business of diplomacy. Diplomacy is to identify those interests and align those interests so that you have the right outcome. So if you think about this in terms of economic prosperity, or miracle even, as you call it after Deng Xiaoping, the important element in that was the accession of China to the WTO. Vietnam later, but China's accession to the WTO. Those are rules that if you look inside those rules, where the debate has been about piracy of intellectual property for a long time, at some point I think, Sonia, where you will be right, there will be enough intellectual property in China that those who are pirating will say, no, we can't do this anymore. And the Chinese government will be able to say, we have to follow those rules. That's kind of the dynamic that I see that we have to work together to achieve. So the Trans-Pacific Partnership is a very important element, because if the Trans-Pacific Partnership and, in a larger sense, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership come together, those are rules that create, in the transatlantic side just alone, 800 million consumers. And if you add the TPP number of consumers, you have the kingpin to this prosperity that China needs. That means it's in their interest. And trying to define those interests and then to relate them to other things. And the sea lanes are critical in this issue. So if you have the economic relationship in Trans-Pacific and transatlantic partnerships, and you have the WTO, and those interests are challenged because of what's happening in the sea lanes that lead to something like 60 to 80% of the world trade, and all the energy issues that transfer through the Malaccan Straits, then you have a way to talk about what are your interests and how do they relate to, maybe we should resolve some of these territorial issues or sea issues in a peaceful way. So I think you're absolutely right. How do we do that in diplomacy? That's the challenge, is what you said. You know, what structures do we do? Yeah. I think we can be creative. I think that's what the Boston Global Forum has asked us to do, to think through, right? Yeah. To think through what are some of the options, what kind of framework. And that's, for me, that's one of those elements of that framework where you shift interests to the right outcomes. But you need transparency, you need to understand the calculations of where you are coming from, to dismiss those things that are ideologically based or nationalistic based, whatever they are, that lead you astray, and come back and say, you know, there's nothing wrong with talking about interests. Interests are very important, and how they relate to your principles. And so if you can align your interests with your principles, then you can have a basis for structures around that.
Yeah, but I want to ask, which forum could be appropriate to discuss those things? Because one reader questioned that with some incident in the EC, it showed that the ASEAN failed the test to show their unity and result in dealing with China. So is it ASEAN and its mechanism is still appropriate to deal with China?
I think at this point the structures are too amorphous. They're not developed enough. Yeah. On the other hand, I wouldn't reject them at all. I would say you have to go back to ASEAN and have that conversation and push that conversation. The Asia Summit is another, because it's a larger group. Yeah. And you can, in that group, and then beyond that, you can do bilaterals. There's a lot of things you can do bilaterally that in that context of multilateral discussions that say, you know, for the United States and China, when we're talking, we can support the resolution of issues. So, and we can make the point that some provocative issues cross that line. And so we can do that, but also you all can also do that in terms of where's the line, so that we can have over time, hopefully we don't have a crisis, but over time we can build that understanding and openness that allows ASEAN to say, well, we can take another step that we haven't taken before. Yeah. Or in the Asia Summit, the parties that are there can say, yes, okay, or rather than you can go to the law to see that Chinese have refused to participate in the arbitration with the Filipinos. So maybe there will be in their interest at some point to do that. I mean, they have already published their position. They have their legal position, of course they know. Vietnam also has its legal position. So there are elements that are there that are possible, but then it's bringing them together. I don't know, what do you think?
Well, I can understand why there are those critics on ASEAN, and that's because there's too much expectation on ASEAN. Just imagine how would it be without ASEAN, Where would you discuss all this DOC? Where would you promote all this maritime security in Southeast Asia? It is in those ASEAN-led mechanisms where you discuss where diplomacy happens. And given that diplomacy is so important to avoid miscalculation and to promote cooperation, where would those things happen without the mechanisms that ASEAN created? So I don't discount the fact that ASEAN hasn't been able to prevent some of those incidents, but after each and every incident, ASEAN learned something and ASEAN make a progress. Take the incidents, the oil rig incidents, for example. ASEAN has actually made the strongest statement it has made in 20 years in criticizing China of the incident. So that is a huge progress by ASEAN. And not only ASEAN as a group, individual ASEAN countries have also made further their policy on the South China Sea or the East Sea, on how to become a more active player in contributing to securing peace in the South China Sea. And this is not just the claimants country. The non-claimants country are also now contributing to the process as well. Take Thailand, for example. Take Myanmar, for example. They are a non-claimant in the South China Sea. However, they have contributed hugely in encouraging ASEAN to come up with a single statement, single voice towards China on the issue. So you have to see that, and you have to see that ASEAN, there's nothing that is going to happen in ASEAN overnight. You have to be patient on ASEAN, but give ASEAN time, and it's going to deliver.
Yeah.
And keep the United States involved.
Yeah.
Sure, that's the purpose of ASEAN.
I understand that, and I'm very much in favor of that, because it is an American interest also to be in the region, but it's also our interest to have issues resolved. And if not resolved, a structure where you can manage them. So governments are in the business of managing issues. We're in the issue as diplomacy to try to think ahead and to try to understand how to change things in a positive way. But I give one word of caution, and one word of caution is that diplomacy without arms is like an orchestra without instruments. So we all have to be realistic that as we watch our diplomacy and the Chinese and your own diplomacy, that if it isn't backed with a serious military possibility, not I'm arguing that it be used, but that you have to have the ability to, when you said enforce, you have to be there to enforce. And to not use it is a trick for diplomacy, to know when it's possible and when it's not useful to go down that path. If you don't have both, that is, if you don't have the diplomacy that works, then you only have the military. That's a disaster, and you want to avoid that disaster. But you don't avoid the disaster by not preparing for conflict. So you prepare for conflict to avoid it. So
it's an interesting point.
Yes.
So that related to what do you think about some scholar in our video conference, latest video conference said that it's more important, that is the United States support individual country to deal with the pressure from China. Do you agree with that point?
No, I don't agree. I think it's important that individual countries deal with China because it's very important bilaterally.
Yeah.
So in the case of Vietnam and China, I think it's important that you have various levels, that you do government levels and you have bilateral discussions and try to make sure that there's no miscalculation.
Yeah.
But in the longer term, I think it's really important that there's in the next level of the people that you're dealing with in the diplomatic academy or in business or in the military or in government, that some structure come together with the Chinese and the Vietnamese where the people at that level who are not responsible to their own organizations but are part of their organizations, that come together and discuss narratives. What's possible, or what are the results? This conversation, you can see what the results are. If it fails, it goes directly to conflict. But Kevin Rudd has suggested an Asia-Pacific community. Well, maybe that's another scenario. Maybe there are other scenarios that only the Vietnamese and Chinese can, at that level, not the governments, but at the think tank level, if you will, they can come together, but come together as a group and talk about what scenarios are, so that you can then talk about the scenarios as what possible is, or you can actually say not what is possible, what the outcomes could be, and then you can argue whether it's possible or not possible, but that's not where you want to start, so that you can have this. I was the negotiator for conflict diamonds. Conflict diamonds, the business community had a 4% illicit diamond trade, and the advocacy groups wanted to destroy the industry. They nearly did. So in the end, they came together, the advocacy groups and the business community, and said, what's the best outcome we could have? And they suggested then a certificate of origin to control the diamonds, and then the governments were brought in. So it's not always that the governments direct things, but we were brought in, and we made an agreement. And in that case, conflict diamonds were reduced and almost eliminated from the market. The conflict in Sierra Leone ended. Today there are 80 countries participating, and conflict diamonds, that is uncut diamonds used for financing rebels and rebellions and other corruption, have been reduced from 4% of the market to 0.4% of the market, almost eliminated. So you can, if you have bilateral discussions among interest groups that can then connect, that's the concept that I think it would be very useful to pursue on a bilateral basis. I don't think that countries can negotiate bilaterally with China and be successful. There's two inherent differences in power positions. You need to do bilateral, and you need to do multilateral.
Yeah.
But not alliances. I'm not suggesting, what she was suggesting is that we would have an alliance against China. And as I said at the outset,
Yeah, okay.
the United States and Vietnam are not going to make an alliance against China. That doesn't work.
Yeah.
But we can do lots of other things that we've been talking about here that do work.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more with Professor Ambassador. There's no single framework which can solve everything. I think the structure which Ambassador point out again and again, and what in this region we call it a regional security architecture or regional architecture, should involve as many bilateral, multilateral, minilateral mechanisms as possible, which can serve and cater to different groups of interest, cater different kind of stakeholders, and serve and comes in different forms, whether official track or unofficial or informal tracks. As long as they serve to help clear the ambiguity, it helps to establish clearer vision and make the perceptions among the stakeholders become clearer. That is going to be helpful in the region, and that is going to contribute to a better outcome. And that is why ASEAN has been, ASEAN as an important regional stakeholder has been encouraging a multi-layered sort of like frameworks, which it created different kind of multilateral processes whereby the memberships are different, the purposes are different, which sometimes are being criticized as being too much overlapping. However, in the ASEAN views, those mechanisms, despite that they are overlapping, it's still helpful, and it does serve the interest of the various countries in the region, and is helping stabilize a very strategically unstable region.
Yeah. So one question for Dr. Sun from reader, that in dealing with the China rise, we observe that the small and middle powers adjusted their foreign policy, and they are maneuvering for balance and advantage. So what about Vietnam?
Well, I first of all have to say that small doesn't necessarily mean weak, and big doesn't necessarily mean powerful. Being as big as China, but it doesn't mean that China is very strong. There's in very way that China is having a lot of internal problem, and in a way China has many weaknesses, And Vietnam, despite being small, it doesn't have to be weak. It can exert its soft power. Look at Singapore. They are such a small country, but nobody says that they are weak politically. They exert their power beyond their punching weight, as they usually call it. So Vietnam can be strong in international and influential in international relations if it knows how to exert its power. So what is the option for Vietnam? I think Vietnam's option is to be with the international community and to be protected by the international community. That means that we have to be fully integrated and cooperative with the international community. We should uphold the rules of the game that the international community endorses, and that is international law. So we should work to support the implementation of international law. We should work to clarify and interpret international law in our context of the East Sea and help that same interpretation adopted by all countries in the region, including China. We should work with ASEAN countries because that's our home organization. We should make ASEAN strong and have a strong voice in international relations. And if ASEAN can influence international relations in our part of the world, then Vietnam is going to have better role and better influence too. So that is the way Vietnam, as a middle or small power, should do in an age where it is perceived that the major powers are increasingly at play.
I would only add to that. I like that description. I think there's a level of bilateral, multilateral, but go one step beyond that. There's also a global aspect.
Yeah, sure.
You've got the Trans-Pacific Partnership we talked about. You've got the World Trade Organization. Just in that area alone, those roles that you play are really very important because that's what the rules will be set up on, not just on the military side. And the security side is really critical, but it's, in my view, it's the way to prevent and to resolve conflict is through diplomacy. And through diplomacy, those institutions that you just talked about, ASEAN in particular, and bilateral relations, and WTO, and the trade and transatlantic trade and investment partnership, those are difficult issues for Vietnam. Those mean changing elements in the economy, listening to global consumers and what their demands are, making sure that the risk in the supply chain that you participate in, as we saw when it fails, as it did at the Shanghai food scandal that was for McDonald's and KFC, whatever position Vietnam finds itself in, that its own brand, its own name, is one of high quality, reliability, and security. So you have you present yourselves in that way globally, not just in the region, and I think you'll do well.
Thank you so much for the very interesting and insightful point of views, both of you. And because it's quite a pity that the time is out, and I know that you have another event to join. Thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very
Great
nice.
pleasure.
Very nice. Very nice.